My husband left me in a hurricane because he thought the house would finish what he was too cowardly to do himself. That is not something I say lightly. I was married to Richard Whitmore for 40 years, and for most of those years, I knew the sound of his footsteps better than I knew my own heartbeat. I knew the way he cleared his throat when he was about to lie politely, the way he folded a napkin when he wanted to avoid a hard conversation, the way he smiled in public with one hand resting on the small of my back like I was something precious he had chosen to protect. But on the afternoon Hurricane Helena came toward Charleston, he looked at me with the calm face of a man carrying out a plan. Not a mistake, a plan. The wind had already started pulling at the shutters when I placed my overnight bag by the front door. It was a small navy bag with a broken zipper I kept meaning to replace, packed with 2 blouses, my heart medication, a phone charger, clean underwear, and the framed picture of Naomi from her law school graduation. I remember that detail because I remember thinking how foolish it was to pack a picture during an evacuation. But at 67, you learn that sometimes a photograph can steady you better than a pill. Richard came down the hallway in his khaki rain jacket, holding his keys and speaking into his phone in that low, careful voice he used when he didn't want me to hear the whole sentence. "No, she's here," he said. "I'm handling it." Then he saw me watching him and ended the call. Before we continue, if you've ever felt overlooked by the very people you built your life around, take a moment after you like and leave a comment to tell me where you're watching from, how old you are, and what time it is where you are. I hope tonight brings you a little more clarity and a little more peace than the last one did. Let's continue. Outside, Evan was loading the SUV like we were going on vacation instead of running from a storm. He had 2 duffel bags, a cooler, a plastic tub full of snacks for the children, and Richard's leather briefcase tucked carefully behind the passenger seat. My grandchildren sat in the back, quiet for once, their little faces pale in the glow of their tablets. Nobody looked at my bag. Nobody asked if I needed help. Richard glanced at the television, where the weather reporter was pointing at a red spiral crawling toward the coast, then looked at me with the same expression he used when a waiter forgot his lemon wedge. "There's a problem," he said. I looked at him, then at the driveway. "What problem?" "There isn't enough room." For a second, I almost laughed, because marriage teaches you many kinds of disappointment, but even after 40 years, there are still moments when cruelty arrives, wearing such a stupid little hat that you don't recognize it at first. "I'll sit in the middle," I said. "I don't need leg room." Richard sighed, and that sigh did something to me. It was tired, impatient, rehearsed, like I was being difficult by wanting to survive. "Margaret, be reasonable," he said. "The kids need space. Evan has supplies. Traffic is already backed up to Mount Pleasant. We can't make this more complicated than it has to be." I looked at Evan through the open doorway. He had stopped moving. His hand was on the trunk, but he wasn't closing it. He stared down at the wet driveway like there was something interesting in the cracks. "Evan," I called. "Is that what you think too?" He didn't answer right away. That silence told me more than any sentence could have. Finally, he cleared his throat and said, "Dad said you wanted to stay." I turned back to Richard. There it was, the first lie, spoken before the storm had even reached us. "I never said that." Richard stepped closer, lowering his voice, not because he was ashamed, but because he didn't want the neighbors to hear. "Someone has to watch the house. You know how people get after hurricanes. Looters, broken windows, insurance problems. You've always been better with the house than anyone." Better with the house. After 40 years of cooking in that kitchen, polishing that dining table, paying those bills, replacing the porch cushions every spring, arguing with contractors, labeling fuse boxes, remembering birthdays, remembering prescriptions, remembering everything Richard forgot because he had the luxury of forgetting, I had finally been reduced to the one thing I had maintained: a housekeeper with a wedding ring. "I'm not staying here alone," I said. His face hardened, but only for a second. Then he smiled, that public smile, the one church ladies trusted and bankers respected. "It's one night," he said. "Stop making it dramatic." The rain began then. light at first, tapping against the porch roof. One of my grandsons looked up from his tablet and whispered, "Grandma's not coming?" Richard didn't even turn around. "Grandma's helping us," he said. That sentence landed harder than if he had shouted, because it sounded noble. It made my abandonment sound like a duty. It made my fear sound selfish. He picked up my overnight bag, carried it back inside, and placed it beside the hall table as carefully as if he were returning a library book. Then he walked around the house. At first, I thought he was checking the shutters. I stood in the foyer, hearing the metallic clicks from outside, one window after another, each sound small enough to be dismissed if you wanted to dismiss it. But something about the rhythm bothered me. Click, pause. Click, pause. Not the hurried movement of a man protecting his home from a storm, but the measured work of a man making sure something stayed exactly where he wanted it. When he came back in, his hair was damp and his glasses were spotted with rain. "All secured," he said. I moved toward the side window. He caught my wrist. Not hard enough to bruise, just hard enough to remind me that he could. "Leave it," he said. "You'll just work yourself up." I looked down at his hand on me. He let go. Then he opened the front door and stepped out into the rain. At the bottom of the porch steps, he turned back one last time. Evan was already in the driver's seat now, though he had no reason to be. The children were quiet. The engine was running. Richard looked at me, and for one strange second, I thought I saw something like regret pass across his face. Then he said, "I closed the windows from the outside. That way you won't get any ideas about wandering around in the storm." I stared at him. "What did you just say?" He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Just keeping you safe, Margaret." Then, softer, almost under his breath, he added, "So you don't start thinking strange things." He closed the door. Not slammed, closed. That was worse, because a slammed door is anger. A closed door is decision. I stood there until the SUV backed out of the driveway and disappeared behind the curtain of rain. I waited for him to stop, to brake, to realize what he had done, to come back up the steps with some half-hearted apology about stress and storm warnings and poor judgment. But the taillights vanished, and the house, my house, went quiet around me. The power died at 8:17 p.m. I know the exact time because the microwave clock blinked once, then went black, and I remember staring at it like it had betrayed me too. The refrigerator gave one last tired hum before going silent. The air conditioner stopped. The television cut off mid-sentence, leaving the weather reporter's warning unfinished. I lit candles from the junk drawer, the cheap white ones I usually saved for dinner parties that never happened anymore. My hands shook when I struck the match, and I hated that. I hated that after everything, after childbirth and funerals and taxes and Richard's temper wrapped in politeness, my hands still shook because a man had left me alone in the dark. Water started coming in under the back door around 9. Not much at first, just a thin silver line spreading across the kitchen tile. I rolled towels and pushed them against the frame, then went to the living room to check the windows. The first one didn't open. Neither did the second. By the third, I already knew. Still, I tried every window in that house, because sometimes the body needs proof before the heart can accept what it already knows. I pushed, pulled, twisted the latches until my fingers hurt. The dining room window, the guest room window, the little window above Richard's desk where he used to smoke cigars when he thought I couldn't smell them. All locked. From the outside. I stood in the hallway with rainwater soaking the hem of my pants and candle wax dripping onto my hand, and I understood something so clearly it almost calmed me. Richard had not forgotten me. He had contained me. And once I understood that, I stopped crying. I didn't call Naomi. I didn't call 911. I didn't call Richard. My phone was at 9%, and something in me knew I needed to save it, not just for help, but for whatever came after. Because if your husband leaves you locked inside a house during a hurricane, the question is no longer whether he loves you. The question is what he is afraid you might live long enough to say. So I sat at the kitchen table while the storm beat against the walls and the water crawled farther across the floor. I wrapped my cardigan tighter around myself, placed my medication bottle beside the candle, and listened to the house groan in the dark. The old beams cracked. The shutters banged. Somewhere upstairs, glass broke, or maybe something fell. I didn't move. I was afraid. Of course I was afraid. Only a fool would pretend otherwise. But beneath the fear, something else was waking up, something older than my marriage and quieter than rage. I thought about all the times Richard had called me confused in front of other people, all the times he had told Naomi I was tired, forgetful, emotional. All the times he had placed papers in front of me and said, "Just sign here, Margaret, it's nothing." And for the first time, those memories didn't feel separate. They felt like a trail. Morning came gray and swollen, with the kind of silence that follows damage. The storm had moved inland, leaving branches across the yard and brown water pooled along the baseboards. My knees ached when I stood. My throat was raw. My clothes smelled like damp wood and candle smoke. Then my phone lit up. One buzz, then another, then another. I picked it up. 47 missed calls, all from Richard. The first text was sent at 6:12 a.m. "Please, answer the phone." I stared at those words for a long time. Then I looked at the locked windows, the water on the floor, my overnight bag still sitting by the hall table where he had placed it, and suddenly, I knew one thing with absolute certainty. Richard wasn't calling because he was worried I had died. He was calling because he had just realized I hadn't. The house was never truly silent, not even when the power went out and the storm pressed itself against the walls like something alive. But that night, it felt like every sound had a meaning, and every shadow carried a memory I had spent years ignoring because it was easier to call it marriage than what it really was. I sat at the kitchen table for a long time after the last message from Richard came through. The candle burnt low enough to pool wax across the saucer, my phone face down in front of me, because I did not trust myself to read his words again without hearing his voice in my head. That calm, reasonable tone he used when he wanted to make something unreasonable feel inevitable. The water had crept farther into the room by then, a thin, steady sheet spreading across the tile, soaking into the rolled towels I had pushed against the back door. And I remember thinking how strange it was that I had spent decades keeping this house clean, dry, in order. And now it was quietly filling itself with the outside world, as if it no longer belonged to me. I stood up slowly, my knees stiff, my back aching in that dull, familiar way that comes with age and long days, and reached for the small flashlight I kept in the junk drawer beside the stove. The one Richard used to complain about because I insisted on checking the batteries every few months, insisting that preparedness was not paranoia, that it was simply the habit of someone who had learned the cost of not being ready. The beam flickered once when I turned it on, then steadied. That small circle of light became my world. I moved through the kitchen first, opening drawers, checking cabinets, not because I needed anything in particular, but because my hands needed something to do, something to anchor me in the present while my mind tried to catch up with what had already happened. The keys were gone. Not just the car keys, which I had half expected after the way Richard had moved so quickly that afternoon, but the spare set I kept in the ceramic bowl by the door, the one with the small crack along the rim that Naomi had made when she was 16 and pretending not to cry after dropping it. I always left them there out of habit, out of trust, out of the belief that there was no reason to hide access to my own life. The bowl was empty. I stood there for a moment, the flashlight resting against the chipped ceramic, and felt something inside me tighten again. Not panic, not yet, but something colder, something that began to arrange the facts in a line I could no longer avoid looking at. I moved to the pantry. The battery packs were gone too. Not all of them, just the good ones, the ones I kept charged and ready. The ones Richard had laughed about last spring when I had replaced them after a minor storm knocked the power out for 3 hours, and he told me I was preparing for the apocalypse instead of enjoying retirement. The cheap ones were still there, half dead, forgotten, useless. I checked the hall closet next, where I kept the emergency radio, the one Naomi had given me years ago after another hurricane, pressing it into my hands with that determined look she had always had when she thought I wasn't taking care of myself enough. "That way you don't have to rely on anyone," she had said. The shelf was empty. I stood in the doorway of that closet longer than I should have, the beam of the flashlight shaking slightly now as it traced the outline where the radio had been, the dust marking its absence more clearly than its presence ever had. And I felt something shift again, something quieter than fear but more dangerous, because it came with understanding. Richard had not packed in a hurry. He had packed with intention. The storm outside grew louder then, a sudden gust rattling the shutters, rain striking the roof in a hard, relentless rhythm. And somewhere in the house, a door slammed, the sound echoing down the hallway like a warning I could no longer pretend not to hear. I moved toward my bedroom. The air felt heavier there, warmer, the smell of Richard's cologne still lingering faintly on the pillow, a scent I had once found comforting, something that meant he was home, that I was not alone in the world, that whatever we were had weight and shape and permanence. I sat on the edge of the bed and opened the top drawer of the nightstand. My medication was gone. Not all of it, just the one bottle I needed most, the one from my heart, the one I never forgot because forgetting it even once left me dizzy, breathless, reminded me in a quiet, humiliating way that my body was no longer entirely under my control. The empty space where it had been stared back at me. I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. "Of course," I whispered, though there was no one there to hear it. Of course he had taken that too. The storm did not frighten me in that moment. The dark did not frighten me. The idea that something could break through the windows or the doors and reach me did not frighten me. What frightened me was the realization that the most dangerous thing in that house had already left it. I leaned back slowly, the mattress dipping under my weight, the flashlight resting against my chest as I stared at the ceiling, watching the shadows shift with every movement of the flame in the kitchen. And for the first time since the storm had begun, I allowed myself to think not about the night, but about the months that had led to it. Richard had started using certain words more often. Forgetful, tired, confused. At first, they had been said gently, almost with concern, the way someone might comment on a change in the weather, something neutral, something not meant to hurt. "You forgot to lock the back door, Margaret," he would say, even when I knew I had it. "You signed the wrong line here," he would add, sliding papers toward me with a small smile, tapping the page as if the mistake were obvious. "You should let me handle this," he would finish, his tone patient, practiced, as if he were explaining something to a child, rather than speaking to the woman who had balanced our books for decades without a single missed payment. I had argued at first, then I had corrected. Then I had checked my own memory, twice, 3 times, standing in rooms trying to remember if I had already done something, or if I had only meant to. And slowly, without realizing it, I had started to doubt myself in ways I had never done before. He had called Naomi less, or rather, he had spoken to her without me. I noticed it one evening when I walked into the living room and he ended a call too quickly, turning the television volume up before I could ask who it had been. "Just Naomi," he had said. "She's busy. No need to bother her with small things." Small things, like my health, like the house, like the way I had begun to feel like a guest in my own life. I sat up again, the mattress creaking beneath me, and forced myself to stand, because the more I thought, the clearer everything became, and I needed to see, to touch, to confirm that what I was beginning to understand was not just the product of fear and exhaustion. The water had reached the hallway by then, a shallow layer spreading toward the study, seeping under the door like something patient, something that would take its time. I grabbed more towels and pushed them against the threshold, kneeling down despite the ache in my joints, pressing the fabric into place with more force than necessary, as if I could hold back more than just water. When I stood again, my eyes fell on the desk, Richard's desk. He had always kept it locked, not because he had anything to hide, or so he said, but because papers get misplaced, because order matters, because not everything needs to be shared. The bottom drawer was slightly ajar. That alone was enough to make me pause. Richard did not leave things half done. I stepped closer, the flashlight beam sliding across the wood, catching on the edge of the drawer, and reached out slowly, pulling it open the rest of the way. Inside, everything looked ordinary at first glance. Folders, receipts, a leather-bound planner. But there, beneath a stack of documents, was something new. A manila envelope, thicker than the rest, sealed but not properly, as if it had been opened in a hurry and closed again without care. I picked it up. My hands did not shake this time. I opened it. Inside were copies of documents, printed cleanly, neatly, the kind of paperwork that comes from a company that prides itself on clarity and precision. Insurance. My name at the top, Margaret Whitmore. I read slowly, my eyes moving across the page, the words settling into place one by one, forming something I could no longer misunderstand. Policy updated. Coverage increased. Effective date, 11 days ago. Primary beneficiary, Richard Whitmore. Secondary beneficiary, Evan Whitmore. I felt something inside me go very still. Not break, not shatter, still. Because fear can scatter you, but understanding gathers you into something sharper. I flipped to the last page. Signature line, my name, signed, dated. I stared at it for a long time, the ink familiar, almost convincing, the curve of the letters close enough to mine that anyone glancing at it would accept it without question. But I knew the way my hand moved. I knew the pressure I used. I knew the small hesitation before the final stroke of my last name. This was not mine. The storm raged outside, the house groaned, the water continued its slow, steady advance across the floor, but none of that mattered anymore. Because in that moment, standing in the dim light of a dying flashlight, holding a document that said my life had been reassigned to someone else, I understood something that no amount of wind or darkness could hide. Richard had not left me in that house to protect it. He had left me there because, to him, I had already become something else. A problem, an asset, a number on a page. And for the first time in 40 years, I realized my husband had been preparing for my death long before the storm ever arrived. The morning after the storm didn't feel like relief. It felt like exposure. The sky was a dull, washed-out gray, the kind that made everything look older than it was, like the storm had peeled something back and left the truth sitting out in the open where you couldn't ignore it anymore. The air smelled like wet wood, salt, and something faintly metallic, like the aftermath of something that had already decided its outcome before it even began. I had been awake for hours by the time I heard the car. Not Richard's car. A different engine, lighter, quicker, pulling into the driveway with a sharpness that didn't belong to him. I didn't move right away. I stood in the kitchen, barefoot on damp tile, the hem of my pants still stiff from where the water had soaked them overnight, and I closed my eyes for just a moment because I already knew who it was. Naomi didn't knock. She opened the door like she had when she was younger, fast and direct, like the house still belonged to her in a way it no longer did, and for a second, I saw her not as the woman she had become, but as the girl who used to run through these rooms with her hair half tied back and her shoes in her hand because she was always late for something. Then she saw me, and whatever softness had been there disappeared. "Mom," she said, her voice tight, already carrying judgment before I had spoken a single word. "What were you thinking?" I didn't answer right away, because there are questions that are not really questions, and answers that don't matter unless the person asking is ready to hear them. Naomi stepped further inside, her eyes moving quickly over the room, taking in the water stains along the baseboards, the towels pushed against the doors, the half-burned candle on the table, but none of it seemed to register the way I thought it would. "You didn't leave," she said again, this time sharper. "Dad said you refused. He said you made a scene and wouldn't get in the car." I let out a slow breath. Of course he had. "He told you that," I said, not asking, just confirming. Naomi crossed her arms, her posture rigid in a way that reminded me too much of Richard. That same controlled anger, that same certainty that she already understood the situation better than the person standing in front of her. "He was worried about you," she said. "He said you've been difficult lately, that you're not thinking clearly, that you keep forgetting things and—" She stopped, not because she had run out of words, but because she finally looked at me. really looked. And something didn't match what she had been told. I hadn't cried, not once since the night before. My hair was pulled back the way I always wore it, my hands steady at my sides, my voice when I spoke, calm in a way that didn't belong to someone who had just spent a hurricane locked inside her own home. I didn't refuse, I said. Naomi's jaw tightened. Dad said, I know what he said. The silence that followed was not loud, but it had weight. I turned and walked toward the living room window. Come here, I said. She hesitated, just for a second, then followed, her steps slower now, less certain. I reached for the latch and pushed. The window didn't move. I tried again, harder this time, letting the resistance speak for itself. It's swollen from the storm, Naomi said quickly, almost too quickly, like she was filling the space before something else could. Is it? I stepped aside and let her try. She grabbed the latch, twisted it, pushed against the frame, then pulled back, her brow furrowing slightly as she tried again, this time using more force. It didn't budge. Try the next one, I said quietly. She did. Then the one after that, and the one after that. By the fourth window, she wasn't speaking anymore. She was just moving. Testing. Realizing. These were locked, I said, not raising my voice, not needing to. From the outside. Naomi straightened slowly, her hand still resting against the frame. That doesn't make sense, she said. No, I agreed. It doesn't. She turned to me then, searching my face for something, maybe confusion, maybe exaggeration, maybe any sign that this could still be explained in a way that didn't break the version of her father she had carried for most of her life. He wouldn't do that, she said. It wasn't a statement, it was a defense. I didn't argue with her. I walked back into the hallway and opened the drawer beside the stove, the one where I kept the spare keys, then turned it toward her. Look. She stepped closer. The bowl was empty. That doesn't prove anything, she said. But there was less certainty in her voice now. I nodded. You're right, I said. It doesn't. I moved past her, into the bedroom, and opened the nightstand drawer. This might. She followed again, slower this time. I picked up the empty space where my medication should have been, letting the absence speak before I did. My heart medication, I said. Gone. Naomi's eyes flicked to mine. He probably packed it, she said. For you, in case... In case what? She didn't answer, because now she was starting to understand that none of this fit the story she had been given. I asked him where it was last night. I continued, though that wasn't entirely true, because I hadn't asked, I had simply known. He didn't answer. Naomi ran a hand through her hair, something she only did when she was trying to hold on to control. He said you've been forgetting to take it, she said, softer now. He said he was worried you'd mix things up. I let out a quiet breath. There it was. Not new, just clearer now. He's been saying that for a while, hasn't he? I asked. Naomi didn't respond right away. Instead, she looked around the room, taking in details she had missed before. The dampness along the floor, the way the drawers were slightly open, the faint smell of candle smoke that hadn't fully left the air. He said you signed the wrong insurance form last month, she said finally. He said you got confused about the bank statement. He said that I wasn't myself. She looked at me. Yes. I nodded slowly, more to myself than to her. That must have been convenient. The words hung there, heavier than I intended, but I didn't take them back. Naomi's expression shifted, not fully, not yet, but enough that I could see the first crack forming in something she had believed for a long time. That doesn't mean he left you here on purpose, she said, but now it sounded like she was trying to convince herself. No, I said, it doesn't. Another silence, longer this time. Then a voice came from the front door. Margaret? We both turned, Clara Belle stood in the doorway, her raincoat still damp, her gray hair pulled back in a loose knot that had come undone on one side. She had lived next door for as long as I had, long enough to know the rhythms of this house, long enough to recognize when something was wrong even before anyone said it out loud. "Oh, thank God," she said, stepping inside. "I saw Naomi's car and I thought..." She stopped when she noticed the tension in the room, her eyes moving between us. "Clara," I said gently, "you came by last night, didn't you?" Naomi turned sharply toward her. Clara hesitated, just for a moment, then nodded. "I did," she said. "When the wind picked up, I wanted to make sure you all had gotten out." Naomi's voice came out quick. "We did." Clara looked at her, then back at me. "All of you?" she asked. The room went very still. Naomi's arms tightened across her chest. "What do you mean?" Clara shifted her weight, clearly uncomfortable now, clearly realizing she had stepped into something she hadn't meant to, but it was too late to step back out. "I knocked," she said slowly. "I saw Richard outside. He was closing up the last window." Naomi's head turned toward me, then back to Clara. "And?" she asked. Clara swallowed. "And I said, 'Is Margaret coming with you?'" Naomi's breathing changed. "And what did he say?" Clara's eyes flicked to me, then back to Naomi, and when she spoke, her voice was softer, but every word landed like it had been waiting for this moment. "He said..." She paused, just long enough to make sure she remembered it exactly right. "He said, 'Just leave her in there. We'll deal with it in the morning.'" The words settled into the room like something final. Naomi didn't move, didn't speak. Her face didn't change all at once, but I watched it happen piece by piece, the certainty draining out of it, the anger shifting into something else, something harder, something quieter. She looked at me then, really looked this time. Not at the house, not at the windows, not at the empty drawer. At me. And for the first time since she had walked through that door, she didn't see a problem. She saw a question. And she didn't have an answer for it anymore. Naomi didn't say anything for almost a full minute after Clara left. She stood in the hallway with one hand on the back of the chair, staring toward the windows as if they might explain themselves if she looked long enough. Outside, branches lay scattered across the yard. Strips of wet leaves stuck to the porch steps, and the whole street had that stunned, washed-out look neighborhoods get after a storm, when everyone comes outside pretending to check damage, but really checking whether life still looks the same. Inside my house, nothing looked the same anymore. Not to me. And finally, not to my daughter. Naomi turned slowly, her face pale in the gray morning light. "Show me the papers." I didn't ask which papers. There are moments when a person's voice changes, not loudly, not dramatically, but enough that you know they've crossed from disbelief into duty. Naomi had been my little girl once, the one who cried when she lost her first tooth and slept with a stuffed rabbit until she was 10. But standing there in my damp hallway, with her jaws set and her eyes sharp, she became the insurance attorney I had bragged about to every woman at church who would listen. I led her into Richard's study. The room smelled like wet paper and old wood. The towel I had pressed against the door was soaked through, and a narrow line of water had crept under the desk, darkening the rug Richard had bought in Savannah and told everyone was antique, though I knew he had gotten it discounted because the corner was frayed. The manila envelope was still on the desk where I had left it. Naomi put on reading glasses she pulled from her purse and opened the folder carefully, not like a daughter handling her mother's private documents, but like a lawyer handling evidence. That alone made my stomach tighten. She read the first page, then the second, then went back to the first again. Her expression changed so slowly that, if I had not been watching her as closely as I was, I might have missed it. Her brows drew together first, then her mouth tightened. Then the color that had returned to her face after Clara's visit faded again. "Mom," she said quietly, "when did you agree to increase your life insurance coverage?" I didn't. Her eyes stayed on the page. "This says the policy was amended 11 days ago." 11 days before the storm, I said. She didn't answer. She only flipped another page. The sound of paper turning in that room felt louder than the storm had. I stood near the door with my arms wrapped around myself, suddenly cold despite the heavy air, watching my daughter read the details of my own life like she was searching for the moment someone had placed a price on it. "This isn't a small increase," she said finally. This is almost triple the original coverage." I looked at the page, though I already knew what it said. Numbers have a way of being cruel when they are attached to a person. "How much?" I asked. Naomi hesitated. That frightened me more than the answer would have. 2.7 million, she said. For a moment, all I heard was the drip of water somewhere near the window. $2.7 million. That was apparently what my absence was worth. Naomi turned the page again. Primary beneficiary, Richard Whitmore. Secondary beneficiary, Evan Whitmore. She said Evan's name differently than she had the others, slower, as if it had caught on something inside her. I thought of Evan in the driveway, his hand on the trunk, his eyes turned down to the wet concrete, pretending not to hear me when I asked if he thought I should stay. "He knew," I said. Naomi did not correct me. That was how I knew she was starting to believe it too. She reached the signature page and stopped. I watched her shoulders stiffen. "This is your signature," she said, but there was no confidence in it. "It's supposed to be." She looked up. I stepped closer, standing beside her now, close enough to see the ink, the letters, the shape of my own name written by a hand that had tried very hard to become mine. At first glance, it looked right. That was the ugly genius of it. The M had the same long first stroke. The W curved in the same place. Even the final line under my last name had been copied. The little flourish Richard used to tease me about when we were young, back when he still made teasing feel like affection. But the pressure was wrong. The hesitation was wrong. And near the end of Whitmore, the line trembled in a way my hand never did unless I was exhausted or medicated. Naomi touched the page lightly with one finger, not over the ink, but near it. "Did you sign anything recently?" she asked. The question opened a door in my mind I had not wanted to touch. I saw Richard standing in the bedroom 2 weeks earlier, wearing his reading glasses, holding a clipboard while I sat propped against the pillows, heavy-limbed from the sleeping pill he had insisted I take because I had been worked up after arguing with him about the bank statement. "It's just the property tax update," he had said, placing the pen between my fingers. "Nothing important. County paperwork. Sign here and I'll handle the rest." I remembered the lamp beside the bed throwing a soft yellow circle over the page. I remembered the way the words blurred. I remembered asking if Naomi should look at it first, and Richard laughing gently, as if I had said something sweet but unnecessary. "Margaret," he had said, "we don't need to call our daughter every time a form comes in the mail." I had signed something, or I had tried to. I remembered the pen feeling too heavy. I remembered Richard taking it from my hand before I finished reading. My knees weakened. Naomi saw it and pulled the desk chair toward me. "Sit down," she said, and this time there was no impatience in her voice, only alarm. I sat. "He told me it was property tax paperwork," I said. Naomi closed her eyes for one brief second. When she opened them again, she was no longer just my daughter. She was angry. Not the messy kind of anger that spills everywhere, but the controlled kind that finds targets. "Did you take anything that night?" she asked. "A sleeping pill." "Prescribed?" "Yes." "Did Dad give it to you?" I looked away. That was answer enough. Naomi picked up her phone. "What are you doing?" I asked. "Calling the insurance company." I almost told her not to. It was an old reflex, that urge to stop trouble before it began, to smooth the tablecloth, to lower voices, to keep family matters inside the family, because that is what women of my generation were taught to do, until the silence started costing us more than the truth. But I didn't stop her. She put the phone on speaker. The first call went through an automated menu that asked for policy numbers, dates of birth, last 4 digits, all those small confirmations that make betrayal sound administrative. Naomi answered with clip precision while I sat beside her, staring at the wet rug, trying not to think about Richard's hand guiding mine across a page I hadn't understood. Finally, a woman came on the line. Whitmore Family Policy Services, this is Angela speaking. How may I help you? Naomi gave her name, her credentials, and explained that she was calling with the policyholder present to confirm recent changes. There was typing on the other end, then a pause. I see the amendment, Angela said. Coverage increase submitted 11 days ago. Approved pending final review. Beneficiary update processed. Supplemental rider added. Naomi's eyes lifted to mine. What supplemental rider? She asked. Another pause. The accidental death rider. Naomi's voice stayed steady, but I saw her fingers tighten around the phone. Please specify. Angela hesitated. It appears the request included enhanced payout language in the event of accidental death during a declared natural disaster. The room seemed to tilt, not physically, not enough for anyone watching to see, but inside me, something shifted so violently that I had to grip the edge of the desk. Naomi leaned forward. Who requested that rider? I'm showing the request came through Mr. Richard Whitmore, listed as authorized spouse contact. Was my mother present for that call? I don't have that noted. Was verbal confirmation obtained from the insured? Another pause. I'm not seeing that in the file. Naomi's face went still. That was when I knew. Not suspected. Knew. Richard had not merely changed paperwork. He had built a doorway and waited for the storm to open it. Naomi asked for copies of the call logs, timestamps, amendment forms, and any recorded authorization connected to the policy change. Angela said she would need to escalate the request to the fraud review department. Naomi gave her email, her bar number, and spoke in a voice so calm it almost scared me. When she hung up, neither of us spoke. The house made no sound except the slow dripping of water from somewhere behind the wall. Finally, Naomi turned toward me. Mom, she said, and her voice broke on that one word before she gathered it again. This wasn't panic. I looked at the insurance papers spread across Richard's desk, the new coverage, the forged signature, the beneficiary names, the rider for accidental death during a natural disaster. Then I thought of him standing on the porch in his rain jacket, telling me someone had to watch the house, telling the children Grandma was helping, locking the windows from the outside with that awful, careful patience. No, I said quietly. It wasn't. Naomi covered her mouth with her hand, and for a second she looked young again. Not 39, not a lawyer, not a woman who handled other people's disasters for a living, but my child, my only child, realizing the man she had trusted had been feeding her little pieces of a lie for months. I believed him, she whispered. I wanted to comfort her. A good mother would have said it wasn't her fault, and maybe it wasn't, but I was still human, still wet and cold and tired, still sitting in a room where my own death had been written into a policy document like a business opportunity, and the truth inside me was not gentle enough to hide completely. I know, I said. She looked at me then, and whatever guilt crossed her face hurt me almost as much as Richard had. I'm sorry, she said. I'm so sorry. I reached for her hand. Her fingers were cold. We don't have time for sorry, I said, though my voice was softer than the words. Not yet. Naomi nodded, wiping her eyes quickly, already becoming herself again. What do you want to do? I looked down at the signature one more time. My name, not mine. My life, not his. And something inside me, something Richard had spent years trying to dull with worry, politeness, and doubt, came fully awake. I want every document, I said. Every call, every signature, every account he touched. Naomi's eyes hardened. Then we start with the insurance company, she said. I nodded. Outside, a neighbor's generator sputtered to life, rough and uneven, filling the street with a low mechanical growl. For the first time since the storm began, the sound did not frighten me. It sounded like evidence. We didn't wait long before going to see Evan, because once a truth begins to show itself, it does not like being ignored. And I had learned the hard way that hesitation only gives people time to rearrange their lies into something smoother, something harder to break. The roads were still slick from the storm when Naomi drove us across town, past fallen branches and sagging fences, and neighbors standing in driveways pretending to clean up while watching everything else. Charleston always looks a little softer after a hurricane, like it has exhaled too hard and doesn't quite remember how to hold itself together again. But that morning, everything felt sharper to me, more defined, like the world had lost its ability to blur edges. Evan's house sat at the end of a narrow street lined with aging oaks, the kind of place that had once been comfortable, but now carried the quiet signs of something slipping, something not being maintained the way it used to be. The grass had grown uneven, patches of brown cutting through the green. The mailbox leaned slightly to one side. One of the shutters hung crooked, its hinge rusted and half detached, tapping lightly against the siding with each lingering gust of wind. Naomi parked the car without saying anything. I watched her hands on the steering wheel for a moment, the way her fingers flexed before she let go, and I recognized the feeling behind it because I had carried it myself for years. That moment before confrontation, when you already know something is wrong but you still hope, just a little, that it won't be as bad as you think. "It won't take long," she said, though it sounded more like something she needed to hear than something she believed. I nodded. We walked up the driveway together, the gravel crunching under our shoes, and before we even reached the door, I noticed the car. Or rather, the absence of the one that should have been there. Evan had always been proud of his cars, even when he could not quite afford them, always choosing something just a little too expensive, just a little too polished, something that made people think he was doing better than he actually was. The driveway was empty except for a faded pickup truck I had never seen before. "Where's his car?" Naomi asked quietly. I didn't answer, because I had already started to understand. Naomi knocked. There was a pause, longer than it should have been, followed by the sound of something being moved inside, a chair scraping across the floor, footsteps that hesitated, then resumed. The door opened halfway. Evan stood there in a wrinkled shirt and jeans that looked like he had slept in them, his hair uncombed, his face unshaven in a way that wasn't careless but tired. He blinked when he saw us, not surprised, not relieved, just calculating. "Naomi," he said, then glanced at me, "Margaret." He didn't call me Mom, he hadn't for years. "Can we come in?" Naomi asked. Evan hesitated, just for a fraction of a second, then stepped back, opening the door wider. "Yeah," he said, "of course." The house smelled like stale coffee and something faintly sour, like laundry that had been left too long in the washer. The living room was cluttered in a way that tried to look temporary, but wasn't. Papers stacked unevenly on the coffee table, a blanket draped over the couch, a television still on mute, showing a news anchor talking about storm damage. Naomi didn't sit, neither did I. Evan hovered near the doorway, as if he wasn't sure whether he should stay or leave. "I heard what happened," he said, rubbing the back of his neck. "The storm. Dad said it got bad." "It did," I said. He nodded, looking down at the floor. "Are you okay?" he asked. It was the right question, asked too late. "I'm fine," I said. Naomi stepped forward. "Evan," she said, her voice steady but tight underneath. "We need to talk about yesterday." He shifted his weight. "Yeah," he said. "Dad told me you were upset." I watched his face carefully then, not the words, not the tone, but the small movements around his eyes, the way his mouth tightened just slightly before he spoke, the way his gaze flicked toward the window and back again. He wasn't surprised, not about me being left, not about Naomi being upset, not about any of it. "He told you she refused to leave," Naomi said. Evan shrugged. "He said there wasn't enough room," he answered, "that things got heated." Naomi's jaw clenched. "That's not what happened." Evan didn't respond. That silence again. The same kind I had seen in the driveway. The same kind that says more than any sentence ever could. I stepped forward then, closing the distance between us, slowly, not aggressively, not accusingly, but with a calm I did not feel. "The windows were locked," I said. Evan looked at me. For a moment, just a moment, something flickered there. Not shock, recognition. He covered it quickly. Probably just the storm pressure, he said. Those old frames stick. All of them? Naomi asked. Evan didn't answer right away. Instead, he walked over to the coffee table and picked up a mug, taking a sip even though it was clearly cold, buying himself time, trying to find a version of the truth that would hold long enough to get him through this conversation. Dad was just trying to keep things under control, he said finally. You know how he is. I let out a quiet breath. Yes, I said. I'm starting to. Naomi stepped closer to him. Evan, she said, more forcefully now. This isn't about how he is. Mom was locked inside that house. Her medication was gone. The emergency radio was gone. The spare keys were gone. That's not control. That's... He didn't think it would get that bad. Evan cut in, too quickly, too defensive. Naomi stopped. I watched his face, watched the way the words had come out before he could stop them. He didn't think it would get that bad. I repeated slowly. Evan froze, just for a second, but it was enough. Naomi's eyes narrowed. What does that mean? She asked. Evan shook his head. Nothing, I just meant... Evan. Her voice dropped, quieter, more dangerous. What did he think was going to happen? Evan looked between us, his composure slipping now, the careful balance he had been holding starting to tilt. I don't know, he said. You're making this into something it's not. I took another step forward. Then explain this, I said, my voice still calm, still even, because anger would have made it easier for him to dismiss me. Why did he update my life insurance 11 days ago? Evan's head snapped up. There it was again, not surprise, recognition. Naomi saw it too. Answer her, she said. Evan ran a hand through his hair, pacing now, his movements restless, uneven, like someone trying to outrun a thought that had already caught up to him. You're twisting things, he said. It's just paperwork. $2.7 million worth of paperwork? Naomi shot back. Evan stopped. His shoulders sagged slightly. And then, without thinking, without calculating, without filtering, he said it. Dad said if something happened, it would make things easier with the house. The room went still. Naomi stared at him. What does that mean? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper now. Evan blinked, realizing too late what he had just said. I didn't mean it like that, he said quickly. I just meant... Easier how? Naomi pressed. He looked at me, then away. That the paperwork would be simpler. He muttered. I felt something inside me go cold. Not anger, not even hurt, not in the way I had expected. Something cleaner, clearer, because suddenly everything lined up. You're in trouble, I said. Evan's head snapped back toward me. What? Your house, I continued. It's behind on payments. His face hardened. You don't know what you're talking about. The car, I said, glancing toward the empty driveway. Repossessed. Naomi looked at him sharply. Is that true? Evan didn't answer. That was the answer enough. I stepped closer, my voice still quiet, still controlled. Your wife left, I said, 2 months ago. His jaw tightened. Stop. And you asked Richard for help. I went on, not stopping now, because the truth had momentum and I was done pretending I didn't see it. But he didn't give it to you, not directly. Evan's breathing changed. You don't know anything about. He promised you something else, I said. Silence, heavy, final. Naomi's voice came out hoarse. What did he promise you, Evan? Evan looked at her, then at me, and for a moment I saw it. Not just guilt, not just fear, but resentment.
old, deep. He said, Evan began slowly, that if things worked out, the house could be handled. Naomi's face went pale. Handled how? Evan didn't answer. He didn't have to.
Because I already knew. The house I stood in, the house my parents had left me, the house Richard had never quite owned, never quite controlled, the house that had always been the one thing that was mine before it was ours. I felt a strange, quiet clarity settle over me. Evan had never liked me, not truly. He had tolerated me when it suited him, smiled when his father expected it, but underneath that had always been something else, something harder, something that saw me not as family, but as an obstacle. And now I understood why. Because to him, I was not a person. I was a delay. A signature that had not yet been removed. A life that had not yet been cleared out of the way. Naomi took a step back, shaking her head slowly. This isn't real," she whispered. But it was, and we were standing right in the middle of it. I looked at Evan one last time. "You didn't look surprised," I said quietly. He didn't deny it. He just stood there, silent, caught between the man he had pretended to be and the truth he had already lived with long enough that it no longer shocked him. And that was when I knew. Richard hadn't done this alone. He hadn't needed to. Because sometimes the worst plans don't require loyalty. They only require someone desperate enough to benefit from the outcome. By the time Naomi and I left Evan's house, I no longer felt like a woman trying to understand what had happened to her. I felt like a woman following a trail. That was the difference, and it mattered, because fear makes you look in every direction at once, but a trail gives your anger somewhere to go. The storm had left the streets slick and cluttered, branches piled along curbs, traffic lights blinking red over intersections where drivers moved cautiously, almost politely, as if the whole city had been humbled overnight. Naomi drove with both hands on the wheel, her face set in a way I knew too well, because it was the face she had worn as a child when she had already decided she was right and was only waiting for the world to catch up. Neither of us spoke for the first 10 minutes. There was nothing easy to say after hearing a grown man admit, almost by accident, that your life had been discussed in terms of paperwork and convenience. Finally, Naomi glanced at me. "The house," she said. I knew exactly what she meant. "Yes." "Do you know if Dad ever tried to borrow against it?" I looked out the window at a fallen oak limb stretching across someone's front yard like a broken arm. "No," I said. "And if he did, I would have had to sign." Naomi's mouth tightened. "Unless he planned to make sure you couldn't." That sentence stayed in the car with us all the way to the bank. Whitmore Community Bank sat on the corner of Broad Street, a red brick building with white columns and brass doors that looked more respectable than most of the people who walked through them. Richard had loved that bank. He liked the smell of polished wood, the framed photographs of old Charleston, the way the tellers knew his name and said, "Mr. Whitmore," as if it still meant something clean. I had been banking there since before I married him. That was the part men like Richard often forgot. Some doors had opened for him because I had been standing beside him. Inside, the lobby smelled faintly of coffee, paper, and lemon cleaner. The lights were too bright after the gray morning outside, and for a moment I felt exposed, as if everyone behind the counter could see the water stain still darkening the bottom of my shoes, the exhaustion around my eyes, the fact that I had spent a hurricane locked inside my own home while my husband drove away with my stepson and my grandchildren. Naomi went straight to the reception desk. "We need to speak with someone about a home equity line of credit inquiry," she said, placing one of her business cards on the counter before the young woman could ask too many questions. "The property belongs in part to my mother, Margaret Whitmore." The young woman's smile faltered slightly at the name. That was the first sign. She looked past us toward the offices along the side wall, then lowered her voice. "Let me see if Miss Harper is available." Naomi and I exchanged a look. "Miss Harper?" I asked. "Denise Harper," the receptionist said. "She handles long-term residential accounts." I knew Denise. Not well, but enough. She had been at that bank for nearly 30 years, a compact woman with silver blonde hair, sharp glasses, and the kind of memory banks pretend their computers have but rarely do. She had helped me set up Naomi's first savings account when Naomi was 8 and insisted on depositing $37 in birthday money because she wanted to be financially independent. A few minutes later, Denise appeared from the hallway. The moment she saw me, her expression changed. Not surprise, recognition with concern behind it. "Margaret," she said, walking toward us faster than I expected. "Oh, honey, are you all right? I heard about the storm damage in your neighborhood." I smiled because old habits are stubborn, and women my age are trained to reassure others even when our lives are sitting in pieces around us. "I'm standing," I said. "That counts for something." Denise looked at Naomi, then back at me, and whatever she saw in our faces made her stop asking polite questions. "Come with me," she said. Her office was small but tidy, with a framed watercolor of Rainbow Row on the wall and a candy dish full of peppermints on the desk. She closed the door behind us, then lowered the blinds, and that simple gesture told me she already knew this conversation was not going to be ordinary. Naomi sat forward. "Miss Harper, did Richard Whitmore come here recently to discuss borrowing against my mother's house?" Denise did not answer right away. She folded her hands on the desk. "That depends," she said carefully. "Are you asking as her daughter or as her attorney?" Naomi reached into her bag and pulled out a folder. "Both." Denise looked at me. "Margaret?" "I want the truth," I said. "All of it." She nodded slowly, then turned to her computer and began typing. The silence in that office felt different from the silence in Evan's living room. This one had rules around it, passwords, privacy screens, compliance language, but underneath all that, the truth was still there, waiting for someone to authorize its release. Denise exhaled through her nose. "Yes," she said finally. "Richard came in 2 weeks ago." Naomi went very still beside me. "With Evan?" I asked. Denise glanced at the screen, then at me. "Yes, Evan was with him." Something inside me tightened, though I had already expected it. There is a particular pain in being right about betrayal. It does not soothe you. It only confirms how little you wanted to know. "What did they ask for?" Naomi said. "A home equity line of credit," Denise replied, "against the Whitmore property." My mouth went dry. The Whitmore property, not Richard's property, not our property. The house my parents had helped me buy before Richard ever added his name to anything. "How much?" I asked. Denise looked uncomfortable now. "Up to $450,000. Naomi's head turned toward me, but I kept my eyes on Denise. "I never agreed to that." "I know," Denise said softly. That answer landed in a way I did not expect, not because it was surprising, but because it was human. She knew. Not legally, perhaps not enough to stop the process immediately, but enough to remember that something had felt wrong. Denise leaned back in her chair. "Richard said you weren't moving around much these days," she continued. "He said the storm season had you anxious, that you were having some health trouble, and that it was difficult for you to come in personally." Naomi's jaw tightened. "And you accepted that?" Denise looked at her calmly. "I did not approve the line," she said. "I opened an application file because he had standing relationship access, but I marked it incomplete, pending Margaret's direct signature and identity verification." For the first time since entering the bank, I felt a thin thread of gratitude. "What else did he say?" I asked. Denise looked down at her hands, then back up. "He said you would sign later. He said, and I remember this because it bothered me, he said, Margaret doesn't get around much anymore, but she understands it needs to be done." Naomi closed her eyes briefly. I could almost hear what she was thinking. There it was again, the same story. The tired wife, the confused wife, the wife who did not move, did not decide, did not need to be asked directly because Richard Whitmore would interpret her wishes for everyone else. "What was the money for?" Naomi asked. Denise clicked again. The stated purpose was property repair, debt consolidation, and emergency liquidity. I almost laughed, not because it was funny, because the language was so clean. Debt consolidation sounded tidy. Emergency liquidity sounded responsible. Neither phrase said desperate stepson, hidden debt, stolen signature, or husband waiting for a hurricane to do what paperwork had not yet allowed him to do. "Did Evan sign anything?" Naomi asked. "No," Denise said. "He had no authority to sign, but he was present for the discussion and—" She paused. "And what?" I asked. Denise opened another tab on her screen. "Richard asked me to print the preliminary disclosures so he could review them at home. I gave the packet to him, but when they left, Evan was the one carrying the envelope." Naomi leaned forward. "Do you have security footage?" Denise looked at her for a moment, then gave a small, tight smile. "Our cameras cover the lobby and consultation hallway." Within minutes, she had called the branch manager, a nervous man named Paul, who looked like he wanted to be anywhere else, and requested access to the footage from that date. He hesitated until Naomi mentioned fraud, elder financial abuse, and the possibility of subpoenaed records. After that, he moved quickly. We watched it on Denise's computer. The video was silent, grainy, and merciless. Richard walked in first, wearing his navy blazer and that pleasant community smile he used like a second wallet. Evan followed behind him, checking his phone, shoulders hunched, eyes scanning the lobby. Denise greeted them. They shook hands. They moved into the side office. Then, 27 minutes later, they came out. Richard held the door. Evan carried the envelope. Not casually, carefully, like it mattered, like it was his. I stared at the screen until Naomi touched my arm. "Mom." I hadn't realized my hand was clenched. Denise printed what she was legally able to provide that day. A summary of the application, timestamps, the incomplete status, the required signature list, and the notation she had entered after the meeting. Applicant states co-owner unable to appear in person due to mobility and cognitive concerns. Direct verification required before approval. Cognitive concerns. I read those words twice, then a third time. That was the phrase Richard had been planning, not just with Naomi, not just with the neighbors, not just in casual conversation over coffee and church potlucks, but in financial records. He was not only making people doubt me, he was making institutions doubt me. Naomi saw it too. "If he could establish diminished capacity," she said slowly, thinking aloud now. "And if something happened to you, or if he filed for emergency authority, he could finish the loan," Denise said quietly. Naomi looked at her. Denise held her gaze. "I'm not saying he would have succeeded," she added, "but yes, it would have made it easier for him to control the property." There was that word again, easier. Evan had said it. Richard had built toward it, and now a bank file had given it shape. I sat back in the chair, looking at the documents spread across Denise Harper's desk, and something inside me settled into a place I did not recognize, but trusted immediately. Cold anger is different from hot anger. Hot anger makes you shout. Cold anger makes you remember account numbers. "Denise," I said, my voice even, "I want copies of everything you can legally give me, and I want the rest preserved." She nodded. "I'll flag the account and freeze any further action pending direct verification from you." "Good," Naomi said. "And please note that any future contact from Richard Whitmore or Evan Whitmore regarding this property must be documented." Denise typed as Naomi spoke. I looked through the glass wall of the office into the lobby, where people were still conducting ordinary business, depositing checks, asking about credit cards, shaking rain from umbrellas, as if the world had not just shown me how calmly a life could be dismantled on paper. When we stood to leave, Denise came around the desk and took my hand. "I'm sorry, Margaret," she said. "I should have called you when he came in." I squeezed her fingers. "No," I said. "You remembered him. That may be enough." Outside, the sky had begun to clear, sunlight breaking through the clouds in thin, pale strips that made the wet pavement shine. Naomi opened the car door for me. I paused before getting in and looked back at the bank. For 40 years, Richard had assumed I would respond to betrayal the way I responded to everything else in our marriage, with silence first, pain second, and action only after I had made sure everyone else was comfortable. But he had miscalculated, because grief had made me tired, fear had made me careful, and now evidence was making me dangerous. Richard came home with flowers. That was the first insult. Not an ambulance, not a police officer, not a real apology carried in a trembling voice, not even the decency to arrive empty-handed and ashamed, but flowers. A neat little bouquet of white lilies wrapped in brown paper. The kind husbands buy when they want the world to see regret without having to feel it too deeply. He stood on the porch just after 6 that evening, damp from the light rain that had started again, holding my heart medication in one hand and the flowers in the other, his hair combed neatly, his face arranged into concern, his mouth turned down in that careful way men use when they are trying to look broken but not guilty. Naomi was still with me. That mattered. I saw the moment Richard noticed her car in the driveway, saw the quick calculation behind his eyes before he raised his hand and knocked, as if he had not lived in that house for 40 years, as if knocking could make him appear respectful now that he had already locked me inside it. Naomi opened the door before I could. "Richard," she said. He smiled at her first, not at me, at her. That told me everything. "Naomi," he said softly, "thank God you're here. I've been worried sick about your mother." I was sitting at the kitchen table with a blanket over my shoulders, not because I needed the warmth, but because Naomi had insisted, and sometimes you let your children care for you because it gives them something to do with their guilt. The insurance papers were no longer in Richard's study. The bank documents were no longer in my purse. Naomi had taken photos, made copies, emailed them to herself, and hidden the originals in a place Richard would never think to look because men like Richard rarely search inside old sewing baskets. Richard stepped inside carefully, like a man entering a hospital room. "Margaret," he said. His voice broke on my name. It was very good. If I had not known him so well, I might have believed it. He crossed the room slowly, placing the flowers on the counter and setting my medication beside them, too visible, too intentional, as if returning what he had taken could become proof that he had never taken it at all. "I brought these," he said. "I found them in my bag. I must have grabbed them by mistake when we were rushing out." I looked at the bottle, then at him. "You packed my heart medication by mistake?" He nodded, already prepared. "I was panicked," he said. "Everything happened so fast." Naomi made a small sound, not quite a laugh, not quite disbelief. Richard glanced at her, then back at me. "I know how it looks," he said. "I do, and I am sorry, more sorry than I can say. I should have come back. I should have made room. I should have forced you into the car, even when you were insisting you wanted to stay." There it was, the lie, softened with guilt, dressed up as concern. Naomi's eyes flashed. "She didn't insist," she said. Richard turned toward her with the expression of a wounded father. "Sweetheart, I know this is upsetting." "Don't call me sweetheart." The room went quiet. For the first time since he walked in, Richard's face slipped, just slightly, just enough for me to see the irritation beneath the grief. Then he recovered. "Naomi," he said carefully, "your mother was very agitated yesterday. The storm had her frightened, and when she gets frightened lately, she sometimes remembers things differently." I felt Naomi stiffen beside me. That was the thing about Richard's cruelty. It never arrived swinging. It arrived holding your coat, lowering its voice, pretending to protect you from embarrassment while quietly moving the knife. I looked down at my hands. They were still. That pleased me. "Differently," I said. Richard took a step toward me. "Yes," he said, gentle now. "And that's not your fault, Margaret. None of this is your fault. You've been under so much stress. Your sleep has been terrible. The doctor said the medication could make you disoriented." "The doctor?" Naomi said. "Which doctor?" Richard ignored her. He reached for me then, one hand extended, his face softening into something almost tender. "I just want to hug my wife," he said. My wife. Not Margaret. Not the woman he left behind. My wife. a title he could use like a deed. He moved closer before I answered, clearly intending for Naomi to see it. This little stage play of reconciliation, the shaken husband returning to comfort the difficult wife, the family healing after a misunderstanding. I could almost see how he would tell it later if I let him. She was emotional. I held her. We're working through it. But I did not stand. I did not lift my arms. When he bent toward me, I turned my head just enough that his embrace landed awkwardly, one arm around my shoulders, the flowers still dripping rainwater onto the counter behind him. He smelled like cedar cologne and hotel soap. Not home. Not anymore. "I'm so sorry," he whispered near my ear, quiet enough that Naomi could not hear every word. "You're making this worse than it needs to be." Then he pulled back with wet eyes. Beautiful performance, wrong audience. Naomi crossed her arms. "Dad, did you lock the windows from the outside?" Richard looked wounded. "I secured the house." "Did you lock them from the outside?" "There was a hurricane coming." "Did you take her keys?" "I packed what I thought we needed." "Did you take her emergency radio?" He sighed then, the smallest sigh, but I heard the impatience in it because I had lived with that sigh longer than I had lived with my own reflection. "Naomi, this interrogation is not helpful." "No," I said quietly. "It's very helpful." Richard looked at me, his eyes sharpened, just for a second. Then he smiled again. "Margaret, honey, who have you spoken to?" There it was. Not, "Are you hurt?" Not, "Were you scared?" Not, "Did you have chest pain?" Who have you spoken to? Naomi heard it too. I saw her head tilt slightly, saw the attorney in her return like a match catching. "Why?" she asked. Richard looked at her, then gave a tired laugh. "Because rumors start quickly after storms. Clara is already telling people God knows what. I don't want this becoming some ugly neighborhood story." I lifted my eyes to his. Clara told the truth. His jaw tightened. "She heard a fragment of a conversation. She heard you say to leave me in here." He looked at Naomi first, not me. That hurt less than it should have. "I was overwhelmed," he said. "I said something careless. People say things in emergencies." "And the insurance company?" Naomi asked. The room changed, not loudly, not dramatically, but something in Richard's face shifted before his mouth did, and for all his years of lying, he had never learned how to stop his eyes from arriving at the truth a second too early. "What about the insurance company?" he asked. Naomi didn't answer. She let the silence sit. Richard turned to me. "Margaret?" I folded my hands on the table. "You tell me." He laughed once, soft and confused, as if we were both being unreasonable. "Life insurance is normal at our age." "Triple coverage is normal?" Naomi asked. His expression hardened. "I was planning for the future." "Whose future?" Another silence. Richard looked from Naomi to me, then back again, and I could see him adjusting, recalculating, trying to determine how much we knew and how much he could still explain away. "Did you call them?" he asked. There it was again. Not denial, damage control. Naomi's voice was flat. "Why does that matter?" "It matters because these companies get nervous over nothing. One wrong phrase and suddenly they flag everything. I was trying to protect the family." "The family?" I repeated. Richard looked relieved, as if he had found softer ground. "Yes, the family. Everything I've done has been for this family." I thought of Evan's empty driveway, the bank footage, the missing medication, the locked windows, the forged signature. And I understood that Richard's idea of family had always been simple. Family meant whatever protected Richard. He stayed for dinner. I did not invite him, but he stayed anyway, moving around the kitchen as if nothing had changed, opening cabinets, wiping counters, asking Naomi if she wanted tea, making himself useful in the way guilty men do when they hope movement can replace accountability. Naomi barely spoke. I watched him. That was all. I watched the way his eyes kept drifting toward the hallway that led to his study. I watched the way he asked, too casually, whether the water had damaged any paperwork. I watched the way he checked the drawer where he had left the insurance envelope, then closed it with his back turned when he realized it was empty. He thought I didn't notice. That was his oldest mistake. By 9, Naomi said she was staying. Richard objected too quickly. "Your mother needs rest," he said. "Too many people here will keep her agitated." "I'm staying," Naomi said. He smiled tightly. Of course. But he did not like it. I could feel that dislike moving through the house like another storm system, quiet but pressurized. At 11, I went to bed. Or rather, I pretended to. Naomi took the guest room down the hall, though I knew she would not sleep. I left my bedroom door open a few inches, the way I used to when Naomi was a baby, and I wanted to hear if she cried. Richard waited nearly an hour. Then I heard him. Soft footsteps. The floorboard near the study gave him away, the same loose board he had promised to fix every spring since 2008. I opened my eyes in the dark and listened as he moved through the room, opening drawers carefully, sliding papers, checking the file cabinet, pausing now and then when the house shifted. He was looking for the envelope, the one he had hidden, the one I had already taken. I lay still, breathing evenly, my hands folded over the blanket, feeling no fear now, only a cold and watchful patience. After several minutes, his footsteps moved toward the back porch. Then came the low murmur of his voice. I got out of bed without turning on the lamp and moved silently down the hall, stopping near the kitchen where I could hear him through the cracked door. He was on the phone with Evan. "No," Richard whispered harshly. "She doesn't have the originals. I checked." A pause. I don't know what Naomi saw. Another pause, longer this time. Then his voice dropped even lower, but not low enough. "She knows more than I thought." I stood in the dark, one hand resting against the wall, and felt something inside me settle completely, not break, not burn, settle. Because now I had what I needed. Not just documents, not just suspicion, behavior, fear. Proof that Richard was no longer trying to save our marriage, our family, or his reputation. He was trying to save himself, and for the first time since he had left me with the windows locked, I was grateful he had underestimated me. Because the woman he thought he had trapped in that house during the storm was gone now. In her place stood someone quieter, older, smarter, and much harder to kill. The next morning I woke before the sun because sleep had stopped trusting me. The house was quiet in that strange way a house becomes quiet after too much truth has moved through it. Not peaceful, not safe, just holding its breath. Richard was asleep in the guest room because Naomi had made it very clear that he was not sharing my bed. And though he had laughed at that as if it were unnecessary drama, he had gone where she told him to go. That alone told me something. Richard could still perform confidence, but he no longer felt in control. Naomi was at the kitchen table when I came downstairs, already dressed, her laptop open, a mug of coffee untouched beside her. She looked tired in the sharp, hollow way grown children look when they begin to understand their parents are not just parents, but people who have been wounded in rooms they never saw. "You heard him last night," she said without looking up. "Yes." "With Evan?" "Yes." She finally looked at me then. "Mom, we need more than fear and bad behavior. We need records, patterns, something that shows this didn't start with the storm." I stood in a doorway, one hand resting on a frame, and I thought about the word patterns. For 40 years, I had cleaned around Richard's patterns. I had explained them, excused them, rewritten them in kinder language, because that is what wives are taught to do when the truth makes the dining room uncomfortable. A late payment became a bookkeeping delay. A secretive call became business. A withdrawal became cash flow. A woman's name became a client. Then I remembered the attic. Not all at once. Memory rarely arrives politely when you're older. It comes sideways, in fragments, through the smell of dust, or the shape of a box, or the sound of a name you haven't said in years. "There may be something," I said. Naomi's chair scraped back. "What?" I looked toward the hallway ceiling, where the attic door sat behind a square panel Richard had always said was too inconvenient to bother with. My old ledgers. The attic smelled like heat, dust, cardboard, and years no one had cared enough to sort. Naomi pulled the cord and the ladder unfolded with a groan that sounded older than both of us. She insisted on going first, but I followed anyway, one careful step at a time, my hand gripping the side rail, my knees complaining, my pride louder than the ache. Richard never came up here. That was why I had kept things here. Not because I was hiding them exactly, at least not at first, but because some part of me had always known Richard did not respect what he could not immediately use. Old birthday cards, tax folders, school drawings, my mother's china wrapped in newspaper, boxes of receipts from the construction company we had built before he learned how to say, "my business," in public, while I balanced every invoice behind the scenes. Naomi turned on the flashlight from her phone and swept the beam across the rafters. "Which box?" "The blue one," I said. "No, not that one, the one behind the Christmas wreath." She dragged it forward, sneezing when dust lifted into the air. The cardboard had softened at the corners, and my handwriting on the lid had faded, but I could still read it. Whitmore Construction, Books, 2003 to 2011. I had written those words before Richard sold the company, before he said we were simplifying our lives, before he convinced me that retirement would be easier if I stopped asking questions about accounts he had already taken care of. Naomi cut through the brittle tape with a key. Inside were folders, old bank statements, payroll copies, yellow legal pads, and beneath them, wrapped in a grocery bag, was the ledger. Green cover, cloth spine, corners worn soft from my hands. I touched it before I picked it up. That book had lived with me through years Richard no longer remembered correctly. Early mornings with coffee gone cold beside the calculator. Late nights at the dining room table while Naomi slept upstairs. Payroll Fridays when a grown man would cry because his check was short, and I would find a way to fix it before Richard ever knew there had been a problem. I opened it. The pages smelled faintly of ink and age. Naomi sat beside me on an overturned storage bin, shoulder almost touching mine, and together we began to read the past. At first it was ordinary. Vendor payments, payroll, insurance, equipment repair. Then I found the first withdrawal. $8,500, RW cash advance, no receipt. I remembered that one. Richard had said it was for subcontractors after a hurricane repair job, men who preferred cash. I had argued that cash was messy, but he had kissed the top of my head and told me I worried too much, and I had written it down because writing things down was how I kept myself from feeling foolish. Then another, $12,000, bridge payment, Evan. Naomi's eyes sharpened. Evan was getting money that far back? I nodded slowly. Richard said it was for school. Evan was 32 in 2008. I know. We turned more pages. The amounts grew larger. $15,000, personal loan, EW. $22,400, temporary family obligation. $9,700, legal cleanup. My handwriting became tighter as the years went on, more cramped, less trusting. I could see myself changing on the page, a woman still doing her job but no longer believing every explanation placed in front of her. Then I saw the name, Grace Holloway. For a moment, the attic seemed to tilt. Naomi noticed my hand stop. Who is Grace Holloway? I stared at the line, $6,000. G. Holloway Consulting. I thought she was a client, I said, but even as I said it, I heard how thin it sounded. We kept reading. Grace appeared again 3 months later, then again, then again. Not always as consulting, sometimes reimbursement, sometimes market research. Once, strangely, Savannah property travel. The payment stretched across years, not weeks, not months, years. Naomi took the ledger gently from my hands and began photographing pages. "Mom," she said carefully, "these aren't random." "I know." "Did Dad ever mention her outside work?" "No." But that was not entirely true. There had been one night, years earlier, when Richard came home smelling faintly of gardenia perfume. Not the kind I wore, not the kind any woman in our circle wore.
And when I asked about it, he told me a client had hugged him too long after a closing dinner. He had laughed. I had laughed too, because sometimes women laugh when they are afraid the alternative will require them to rebuild their lives. Grace Holloway. The name had been there the whole time. Not hidden deeply, just buried under the kind of explanations marriage trains you to accept. Naomi climbed down first, with the ledger tucked under one arm like evidence from a crime scene. I followed more slowly, my body tired, but my mind strangely awake. Downstairs, Richard's door was still closed. The house smelled of coffee now, sunlight spreading across the kitchen floor, making everything look too normal for what we were about to uncover. Naomi opened her laptop and began searching. I sat across from her, watching her fingers move quickly over the keys, feeling the old sick rhythm of waiting for proof. Grace Holloway, she murmured. Savannah, Georgia. A few clicks, then her face changed. What? I asked. She owns a small house outside Savannah. That doesn't mean. It's connected to an LLC. My mouth went dry. Naomi turned a laptop toward me. Marsh Lantern Holdings, LLC. I stared at the name. I knew it. Not well, not enough to explain, but I had seen it before on an old tax document Richard had told me was related to a failed land deal, something not worth worrying about. Naomi kept reading.
The LLC was registered years ago. One of the original organizers. She stopped. I didn't need her to say it, but she did. Richard. The room went silent. Behind us, the refrigerator hummed. Somewhere upstairs, a floorboard creaked, and for one ridiculous second, I thought Richard was standing there, listening. But when I turned, the hallway was empty. Naomi continued, softer now. Mom, if these payments went to Grace, and Grace is connected to an LLC Richard helped create, and that LLC is tied to a house in Savannah? He had another life, I said. The words came out before I could soften them. Another life. Not just an affair. Not just money. A place. A structure. A hidden lane running parallel to our marriage for years while I packed lunches, paid property taxes, bought Christmas gifts for Evan's children, sat through church dinners with Richard's hand resting warmly on my back. I pressed my palms flat against the table. The wood was cool beneath my skin. Naomi reached for my hand, but I pulled back gently, not because I didn't want comfort, but because if she touched me too kindly in that moment, I might fall apart, and I was not ready to give Richard that. He didn't start with the storm, I said. Naomi's eyes filled. No. He started years ago. Yes. I looked down at the ledger again, at my own handwriting, at the careful notes I had made without knowing I was leaving a map for the woman I would become. Back then, I thought I was keeping books for a company. I thought I was protecting Richard from his own disorganization. I thought I was being a good wife. But the truth was colder than that. I had been documenting my own betrayal, line by line, year by year. Naomi closed the laptop halfway. We need to find Grace, she said. I nodded slowly. Yes, I said, we do. And from the hallway, Richard's door opened. Richard came out of the guest room just as Naomi closed the laptop. And for one frozen second, all three of us stood inside the same silence, each pretending not to know that something important had just been discovered. He looked tired. Not guilty, not frightened, not yet. Just tired in the way men look when they have spent too many years believing the world would always arrange itself around their convenience. His shirt was wrinkled, his hair flattened on one side, and his eyes went first to the ledger on the kitchen table before they went to my face. That was how I knew the ledger mattered. What's that? He asked. Naomi's hand moved toward it, but I reached first, closing the cover gently, almost lovingly, as if it were an old family Bible instead of a record of every lie I had been too loyal to understand. Old paperwork, I said. Richard's gaze sharpened. From where? The attic. His face changed again, just slightly, so quickly another woman might have missed it, but I had spent 40 years studying him across breakfast tables, hospital waiting rooms, church pews, and tax appointments. I knew the difference between surprise and alarm. This was alarm.
You shouldn't be climbing into the attic, he said, recovering. You could have fallen.
Naomi stood. She wasn't alone. Richard looked at her, and that old irritation passed between them, the one he tried to hide behind fatherly concern.
I wasn't speaking to you.
No, Naomi said. You were trying to control her. The words landed hard, but Richard only smiled, weary and wounded, the same performance as always.
Is that what we're calling concern now?
I picked up the ledger. No, I said. Concern asks if I'm hurt. Control asks what I found. For a moment, he had no answer, and that was enough. We left for Savannah an hour later. I did not tell Richard where we were going. Naomi did not either.
He asked twice, first casually while pouring coffee, then again from the front porch as Naomi opened the car door for me. The second time, there was less softness in his voice. "Margaret," he called. "Where are you going?" I looked back at him. For 40 years, I had answered that kind of question automatically. The grocery store, the pharmacy, church, Naomi's, as if my movement needed to be filed with him for approval. This time, I said nothing. Naomi started the car. The drive to Savannah took less than 2 hours, but it felt like crossing out of one life and into another. The storm damage thinned as we moved south, branches giving way to wet marshland, gray sky opening into pale sunlight, highway signs flashing past while the ledger sat in my lap like something alive. Grace Holloway lived in a small white house outside the city, set back from the road behind a rusted iron gate and 2 magnolia trees that had grown too large for the yard. It was not the kind of house I had imagined Richard hiding a romance in. There was no glamour to it, no grand porch, no secret luxury. Just peeling paint, clean windows, and a wind chime moving softly in the humid air. Naomi parked near the curb. "Let me do the talking first," she said. I nodded, though I knew I would not keep that promise if Grace looked me in the eye and lied. Grace opened the door before we knocked a second time. She was older than I expected, maybe early 60s, with dark hair streaked heavily with silver, and a face that had learned how not to reveal anything too soon. She wore linen pants, a pale blue sweater, and no wedding ring. Her eyes moved from Naomi to me, then down to the ledger in my hands. She knew. Not all of it, perhaps, but enough. "Mrs. Whitmore," she said. I felt my fingers tighten around the book. "You know who I am." Grace's expression did not change. "Richard showed me pictures years ago." That sentence should have hurt more. Maybe it would have, if I had still believed pain had a bottom. Naomi stepped forward. "We need to ask you some questions about Marsh Lantern Holdings and payments made to you through Whitmore Construction." Grace looked at her. "And you are?" "Naomi Whitmore, Margaret's daughter. I'm also an attorney." Grace gave a faint smile, but there was no warmth in it. "Of course you are." She did not invite us in right away. For several seconds we stood on her porch with the smell of rain and magnolia around us. 3 women bound together by a man who had apparently used each of us differently. Finally, Grace stepped aside. "You have 10 minutes. Her living room was neat, almost too neat, with beige furniture, a glass coffee table, and framed black and white photographs of Savannah streets arranged along one wall. Nothing about the room looked like Richard, and for some reason that unsettled me more than if I had seen his jacket hanging over a chair. Grace sat across from us and folded her hands in her lap. "If you came here to ask if I slept with your husband," she said, looking directly at me, "the answer is no. Not recently. Not in the way you're imagining." Naomi glanced at me, but I did not look away from Grace. "Then what were you to him?" Grace's jaw tightened. "A mistake I stopped making too late." There was something in her voice then, not guilt exactly, but exhaustion. Naomi opened the ledger on the coffee table. "These payments went on for years." "Yes." "For what?" Grace looked toward the window. For the first time since opening the door, she seemed uncertain.
Richard borrowed money, she said finally. I felt the room sharpen around me. From you? No, she said. Through me. Naomi leaned forward. Explain. Grace exhaled slowly. I used to consult for private investment groups, small pools of money, mostly real estate, bridge loans, high-interest arrangements for men who didn't want traditional banks asking too many questions. Loan sharks in nicer shoes, Naomi said. Grace's mouth twitched once. That's one way to say it. I sat very still. Richard borrowed from them. Yes. How much? Grace hesitated. How much? I repeated. Over the years? Close to 700,000. The number moved through me without sound. $700,000. Hidden beneath dinners, holidays, medical appointments, church donations, grandchildren's birthdays. And he used company money to pay it back, Naomi said. Sometimes, Grace replied. Sometimes personal accounts, sometimes cash. Sometimes he just pushed the balance forward. With what collateral? Naomi asked. Grace looked at me then. That was when I knew before she said it. Your house, she said. I did not move. Naomi did. She stood so fast the coffee table rattled. You're telling me my father used my mother's home as collateral for private debt without her consent? Grace's face hardened. Not legally, not on paper. Then how? Grace's eyes returned to mine. A verbal assurance. He said the property would become fully controllable soon. He said there were family arrangements in process. Family arrangements. I almost laughed. Richard had turned my life into a phrase people could say over contracts and coffee. Grace continued, quieter now. I told him that wasn't enough. I told him nobody serious would accept that indefinitely. That if Margaret was still competent, still living there, still required to sign, then the house couldn't be treated as his private reserve. The word competent hung in the room. Naomi heard it too. When did he ask about that? She said. Grace looked away. Last year. My hands went cold. What exactly did he ask? Naomi pressed. Grace hesitated again, and this time I saw fear. Not of us, of what saying it out loud would make real. He asked, she swallowed. He asked what happened if his wife was no longer able to sign. If she was considered medically unfit. If there were ways to proceed through emergency authority. Naomi's face went white. I closed my eyes briefly. There it was. Not a moment of panic. Not a bad decision during a hurricane. A plan with drafts. A plan with legal questions. A plan that had been alive long before the wind reached Charleston. Grace stood abruptly and walked to a small writing desk near the window. She opened the top drawer and pulled out an old phone, the kind people keep after upgrading because some messages are too dangerous to delete and too important to forget. I kept this, she said. Naomi took a step forward. What is it? Grace looked at me. Insurance. She pressed the screen, scrolled, then tapped a voicemail. Richard's voice filled the room. Not the public voice. Not the husband voice. The other one. The one I had heard through doors. Grace, it's me. Listen, the lawyer route is taking too long. She's still sharp enough to make trouble if Naomi starts asking questions, and Evan is getting impatient. If this storm hits the way they're saying, it may solve the timing issue faster than paperwork ever could. Call me back. The voicemail ended. No one spoke. Not Naomi, not Grace, not me. Outside, the wind chime moved gently in the yard, soft and delicate, as if the world had not just handed me my husband's voice discussing my life as an inconvenience to be resolved by weather. Grace sat down again, but her hands were shaking now.
I didn't know he would actually leave you, she said. I thought he was talking like men talk when they're desperate and stupid. I looked at her. No, I said. You knew enough to save the message. She flinched. Good. Some truths deserve to leave marks. Naomi took out her phone. I need you to send me that file. Grace nodded.
And I need you to be willing to testify.
At that, Grace's face closed. No. Naomi's voice sharpened. Grace? No, Grace said again. You don't understand these people. Richard owes money, yes, but the men behind those loans do not like attention. If I testify, I put myself in the middle of something ugly. I leaned forward. You are already in the middle of something ugly. She looked at me then, really looked, and whatever she saw made her go quiet. I did not raise my voice. I did not need to. My husband locked me inside my own house during a hurricane, I said. He took my medication. He took the emergency radio. He tried to make my daughter believe I was confused. He changed my insurance, tried to borrow against my home, and asked people what would happen if I was declared unfit. So when you tell me you're afraid of ugly, Grace, understand something. I paused. Ugly already found me. Grace looked down at the phone in her hand. For a long moment, she did not move. Then she nodded once. I'll testify, she said quietly, but I want protection. Naomi exhaled. We can work with that. Grace sent the voicemail, along with emails, dates, payment records, and documents tying Marsh Lantern Holdings to Richard's old borrowing scheme. By the time we left her house, Naomi's phone had become heavier than the ledger in my lap. On the drive back to Charleston, neither of us spoke for a long time. The marsh stretched beside the highway, gold and gray under a sky finally beginning to clear. I watched the grass bend in the wind and thought about how long Richard had been building an exit from our marriage. Not through divorce, not through honesty, but through paperwork, debt, doubt, and eventually a storm. Naomi finally said, Mom, this is criminal. I looked down at my hands. They did not shake. Yes, I said, it is. And Dad knows we're getting close. I turned toward the window. The reflection looking back at me was older than the woman I had been before Helena, but steadier too. Then he should be scared, I said, because for 40 years Richard had counted on my silence. But now I had his voice. The petition arrived by courier at 9:14 a.m., placed carefully in Naomi's hand as if it were something respectable, instead of what it truly was, a formal attempt to erase me while I was still standing in my own kitchen. Naomi did not open it right away. She stood in the doorway for a moment, the envelope held between her fingers, her shoulders tight, her breathing measured in a way I recognized from the courtroom stories she used to tell me when she first started practicing law. The moment before you read something that will either confirm your fear or deepen it. Then she closed the door. Mom, she said, her voice steady but strained underneath. I need you to sit down. I was already sitting. That seemed to surprise her. I think I already know what it is, I said. Naomi exhaled, long and slow, then slid the envelope open with a letter opener I had owned for 20 years, the blade still sharp because I had always taken care of small things, even when I failed to take care of larger ones. She read the first page silently, then the second. By the third, her jaw had set in a way that meant whatever hope she had held on to was gone. They filed for emergency guardianship, she said. The words did not shock me, they settled, like a final piece clicking into place. On what grounds? I asked. Naomi let out a short, humorless breath. Paranoia, cognitive decline, impaired judgment. They're claiming you're no longer capable of managing your financial or personal affairs. I nodded slowly. And their evidence? She looked at me. You. I almost smiled. Explain. They're using the storm, she said, flipping the page. They're saying you refused to evacuate despite clear danger. that you became agitated, irrational, and put yourself at risk. They're framing it as proof that your decision-making is compromised. I leaned back in the chair. They locked the windows from the outside. I know. They took my medication. I know. They left me without power, without a way out, without a way to call anyone. I know. Naomi's voice cracked then, just slightly, before she steadied it again. But they're saying you chose to stay. Of course they were. Because if they could turn that night into my decision instead of theirs, then everything else would follow naturally. The insurance, the loan, the authority, the control. One narrative, repeated often enough, becomes a structure people trust. And Evan? I asked. Naomi flipped to another page. He filed a supporting affidavit. Says he's concerned about your safety, that you've been forgetful, suspicious, emotionally unstable. I let out a quiet breath. Emotionally unstable, I repeated. Naomi looked at me. I'm going to destroy them for this. I reached across the table and placed my hand over hers. No, I said. She blinked. What? We're going to let them destroy themselves. The hearing was scheduled for the next morning. Emergency petitions move quickly, Naomi explained, especially when the court believes there may be immediate risk. That was the part Richard had counted on. Speed limits resistance. Speed forces decisions before people can gather facts. Speed makes lies look urgent. But Richard had made one mistake. He had assumed I would still be reacting. Instead, I was ready. We spent the afternoon preparing, not scrambling, preparing. Naomi organized the documents with the precision that would have made any judge sit straighter. The insurance policy, the bank footage, Clara's written statement, Grace's voicemail, the ledger. Each piece placed carefully, not as noise, but as a sequence. A story that moved forward with logic instead of emotion. Don't argue, Naomi said as she stacked the folders. Don't defend, just answer. Calmly, clearly. Let the evidence do the work. I nodded. That part would not be difficult, because calm had become something else inside me. Not peace, control. The courtroom smelled like paper, old wood, and the faint trace of coffee that someone had tried to hide but never fully could. It was smaller than I expected, not the dramatic space people imagine when they think of justice, but a practical room where decisions are made quickly and quietly, often without the kind of audience that would demand performance. Richard was already there. So was Evan. They stood together near their attorney, a man in a gray suit who looked efficient and expensive, the kind of lawyer who does not waste words because he assumes the court already leans in his direction. Richard looked at me when I entered. Not softly this time, not with flowers in his hands. There was calculation in his gaze now, and something else beneath it. Fear. Evan did not look at me at all. That was his way, always had been. Naomi walked beside me, her posture straight, her expression unreadable. We took our seats. The judge entered. The hearing began. Richard's attorney stood first.
Your Honor,
He said, smooth and practiced.
we are here because Mr. Whitmore has grave concerns regarding his wife's mental and emotional state. Recent events have demonstrated a clear pattern of impaired judgment and escalating paranoia that puts both her safety and her financial well-being at risk.
I watched him speak, not with anger, with curiosity. He continued.
During Hurricane Helena, Mrs. Whitmore refused evacuation, isolated herself in a structurally compromised home, and exhibited behavior consistent with confusion and distress.
Since that time, she has made a series of unfounded accusations against her husband and stepson, alleging conspiracies without evidence, and has begun interfering with critical financial matters, including insurance and property management. Unfounded, without evidence, interfering. Words chosen carefully to make a woman sound like a problem. Naomi stood when it was her turn. Your Honor, she said, her voice steady, the petitioner's narrative is not only inaccurate, it is strategically constructed to misrepresent a sequence of events that will be clearly demonstrated through documented evidence. The judge nodded. Proceed. Naomi did not rush. She handed over the first document. The insurance policy, she said, updated 11 days before the storm. Substantial increase in payout. Addition of accidental death during natural disaster clause. Richard's attorney shifted slightly. Naomi continued. The bank records and security footage, she said, placing the next file, demonstrating an attempted home equity line of credit against Mrs. Whitmore's property without her knowledge or consent. The judge's expression changed, just slightly, enough. Naomi placed the next document. Statement from Clara Bell, neighbor, confirming that Mr. Whitmore stated, quote, "Leave her in there, we'll deal with it in the morning." Evan's head lifted. Too late. Then Naomi played the voicemail. Richard's voice filled the courtroom, clear, undeniable. The storm may solve the timing issue faster than paperwork. No one spoke when it ended, not immediately. The silence carried weight, real weight. Naomi stepped back. And finally, she said, a ledger maintained by Mrs. Whitmore over multiple years, documenting financial discrepancies, undocumented transfers, and payments connected to both Mr. Whitmore and his son, including references to third-party financial arrangements that will be addressed in separate proceedings. The judge looked at me then. "Mrs. Whitmore," he said, "do you wish to respond?" I stood, not quickly, not dramatically, just stood. "I was locked inside my home during a hurricane," I said. My voice did not shake. "I did not refuse evacuation. I was prevented from leaving. My medication was removed. My emergency communication devices were taken. The doors and windows were secured from the outside." I paused, not for effect, because truth deserves space. "I have been called paranoid," I continued, "but I have not accused without evidence. I have not acted without reason. Everything I have said is supported by records, by witnesses, and by my husband's own words." I looked at Richard then. He did not hold my gaze. "I am not confused," I said. "I am not unstable. I am not incapable. I am a woman who has just discovered that the people closest to her believed she could be removed from her own life without consequence." The judge nodded slowly. Richard's attorney stood, attempted to object, attempted to redirect, attempted to suggest emotional interpretation, but the weight of what had already been presented made his words sound thinner now. The decision came faster than I expected. "The petition for emergency guardianship is denied," the judge said. A pause. Then, more firmly, "Based on the evidence presented, there appears to be sufficient cause to question the motives behind this filing." Richard sat back in his chair. Evan finally looked at me, not with anger, with something closer to realization. They had tried to take my voice, and in doing so, they had given me a platform. As we stood to leave, Naomi touched my arm. Her voice was quiet. "Stay with me here, because what happens next isn't just another piece of evidence. It's the moment everything turns." I glanced at her. She met my eyes. "The truth isn't just coming out," she said. "It's about to explain everything." I nodded, because I felt it too. Not hope, not relief, something sharper. "If you've stayed this far," she added softly, almost to herself, "you're going to want to see how this ends." Outside, the sky had cleared completely, and for the first time since the storm, the air felt like it belonged to me again. The guardianship hearing should have felt like a victory. For a few hours, it almost did. Naomi drove us home with the windows cracked, the air moving through the car clean and sharp after days of dampness. And I sat beside her watching Charleston pass in pieces. Brick walls, broken branches, church steeples, old women sweeping porches, men dragging ruined furniture to the curb. All of us pretending a storm only damages what it touches. But storms reveal things too. They lift shingles, split trees, flood crawl spaces, and expose the rot people have been painting over for years. By the time we reached my house, I already knew the hearing had not ended anything. It had only forced Richard's plan into the open. And once something like that is exposed, you begin looking backward with different eyes. Every conversation changes shape. Every forgotten morning becomes suspicious. Every time someone said you seemed tired, you wonder who taught them to say it. Naomi felt it too. She didn't take off her coat when we walked inside. She set her bag on the kitchen table, opened her laptop, and began typing before I had even put water on for tea. "What are you looking for?" I asked. "Medical records." I stopped near the stove. The word felt small. It wasn't. "Naomi." She didn't look up. He didn't build the guardianship petition overnight. If he was claiming cognitive decline, he needed history. He needed a pattern. Insurance, bank records, neighbor comments. That's one side of it, but medical records would make it feel real. The kettle sat cold in my hand. For a moment, I was back in my bedroom weeks earlier, Richard holding out a glass of water and a small white pill, his voice soft, almost tender. "You need rest, Margaret. You're not yourself when you don't sleep." I had taken it because I was tired, because he was my husband, because trust, after 40 years, can become muscle memory even after love has begun to rot. Naomi called my doctor's office first. The receptionist recognized her voice from years of appointment scheduling because Naomi had become more involved after Richard started telling everyone I was having little episodes. That was what he called them. Little episodes. A misplaced checkbook, a forgotten lunch date he had never written on the calendar, a morning when I woke groggy and asked what day it was, while he stood in the doorway, watching me too carefully. Naomi requested a medication history. There was a pause on the other end, then another. Her face changed. "What do you mean the dosage was increased?" she asked. I sat down. The kitchen chair felt harder than usual. Naomi listened, her eyes fixed on the table, one hand holding the phone, the other slowly closing into a fist. "When was that requested?" she asked. Another pause. "And who called it in?" She looked at me then. I already knew. "Richard," she said. The room did not spin. I almost wished it had. A spinning room gives you something dramatic to hold on to. This was worse. This was clarity, flat and steady and merciless. Naomi ended the call and wrote something down. "Your sleep medication was increased twice in the last 6 months," she said. "Your anti-anxiety medication was also adjusted." I didn't ask for that. I know. I didn't even know. I know. Her voice broke on the second one. I looked toward the hallway, toward the bedroom where I had spent so many mornings sitting on the edge of the bed, waiting for my mind to clear, ashamed of how heavy my body felt, embarrassed when I couldn't remember if I had already fed the cat or paid the electric bill or signed the form Richard said was waiting. "How?" I asked. Naomi swallowed. "He told them you were struggling. He said you were sleeping badly, anxious, confused. He said you refused to call because you were embarrassed." I laughed once. It wasn't humor. It was something uglier. "He made me embarrassed," I said, then used it as proof. Naomi closed her eyes. We went to the pharmacy next, not because we needed more proof, but because Naomi did not trust anything secondhand anymore, and neither did I. The pharmacy sat inside a small grocery store near our neighborhood, the kind of place where people know your name if you buy the same tea every week, and where the young cashier still asked if I wanted help carrying bags, even when all I bought was soup and oranges. The pharmacist, Mr. Pritchard, had been there for years. He was a thin man with kind eyes, the sort who remembered allergies without checking the screen, and always put larger print labels on my bottles because he said there was no dignity in needing a magnifying glass for instructions. When he saw me, his smile appeared automatically, then faded when he noticed Naomi's expression. "Mrs. Whitmore," he said, "everything all right?" Naomi placed her card on the counter. "We need to review my mother's prescription pickup history and any notes connected to dosage changes." Mr. Pritchard looked from her to me. I nodded. "Please," I said. He took us to the consultation window at the side, lowered his voice, and pulled up the records. The computer screen reflected in his glasses as he scrolled. "Yes," he said slowly. "There were changes." Naomi leaned in. "Who picked up the medications?" Mr. Pritchard hesitated. "Usually Mr. Whitmore."
How often? He looked uncomfortable now. Almost every time for the last several months. I gripped the edge of the counter. Richard had told me he was being helpful. You don't need to run errands, Margaret. I'm already out. I had thanked him. God help me, I had thanked him. Naomi's voice sharpened. Did he ever ask questions about the effects? Mr.
Pritchard's expression shifted from discomfort to something closer to alarm. He asked whether increased dosage could cause grogginess, confusion upon waking, things like that. Naomi went very still. And what did you tell him? I told him those can be side effects, especially in older adults, and that if Margaret experienced anything concerning, she should contact her physician directly. He looked at me then, and regret crossed his face. There was one time, he said. Naomi's hand tightened around her pen. What time? Mr. Pritchard glanced toward the main aisle, then lowered his voice further. He asked if there was anything that helped elderly patients sleep more deeply through the night. I remember because I didn't like the phrasing. I told him that was a question for the doctor and that medication should never be used that way. The words moved through me slowly. Sleep more deeply. Not rest better, not feel calmer. Sleep more deeply. The fluorescent lights above the pharmacy seemed too bright suddenly, too ordinary, too cruel for what was being said beneath them. I remembered mornings, not one, many, waking with my mouth dry and my limbs heavy, the room overly bright, Richard already dressed, papers on the bedside table, a pen lying beside them. You signed it last night, he would say when I asked. Or, we talked about it, Margaret. Or, you really don't remember? And always that look, concern on the surface, satisfaction underneath. There was one morning in particular, maybe 3 weeks before the storm, when I woke to sunlight across the comforter and my own signature on a form I could not recall reading. Richard had sat beside me, tying his shoes, and when I asked what it was, he smiled. Nothing important, he said. Just tax updates. I had believed the sleep was my weakness. Now I understood it may have been his tool. Mr.
Pritchard printed what he could. Pick updates, dosage histories, prescriber notes, medication counseling records. Enough to show a pattern if someone cared to look at it honestly. Naomi took the papers with both hands, thanked him, and we walked out through the grocery store without buying anything. In the parking lot, she stopped. For a second, I thought she was checking her phone. Then I saw her shoulders shaking. Naomi, I said. She turned toward me, and the control finally broke. I believed him, she whispered. I reached for her, but she stepped back, not away from me exactly, but away from the comfort she did not think she deserved. He told me you were getting worse, she said, tears spilling now, fast and angry. He told me you were forgetting things, that you were scared, that you were too proud to admit you needed help, and I thought maybe you were just getting older. I thought maybe he was trying. I stood there in the damp parking lot beside a cart return and a cracked patch of asphalt, watching my daughter realize she had been used as part of a trap. You trusted your father, I said. He's not my father, she said sharply. Then her face crumpled. Not because the sentence was wrong, but because some part of her had once wanted it to be true. Richard was her stepfather, technically, but he had been in her life since she was small enough to fall asleep in the back seat after Sunday dinner. He had helped pay for school, walked beside her at graduation, toasted her at her engagement party before the engagement fell apart. He had earned enough of the title to make his betrayal hurt like blood. He made me doubt you, she said. He made me look at you like you were becoming a problem. I took her hand then, whether she thought she deserved it or not. You came back, I said. She shook her head. Too late. No, I said, and this time my voice was firmer. Not too late. Because I was still standing. Because the house had not killed me. Because the storm had passed, and Richard's plan had not. Naomi wiped her face with the sleeve of her coat, an old gesture that made her look 12 years old for one painful second. What kind of man does that? She asked. I looked toward the pharmacy doors. A man who knew paperwork alone wasn't enough, I said. He needed people to believe I was fading before he could make me disappear. That was the final piece. The insurance signature, the home equity loan, the guardianship petition, the locked windows, the missing medication. They were not separate acts, they were steps. Richard had not simply waited for a storm. He had been building one around me for months, maybe years, weakening me in ways no one could see clearly, then pointing at the weakness as proof that I should no longer be trusted. On the drive home, Naomi called Marjorie Fields, an elder abuse attorney she knew from court. Her voice was raw but steady as she explained what we had found. Prescription changes, pharmacy records, insurance amendments, bank footage, witness statements, voicemail. I watched her speak and felt pride rise beneath the grief. My daughter had believed the wrong person for a while, but now she was fighting the right one. When we reached the house, Richard's car was gone. For once, I was glad. The silence inside no longer felt like abandonment. It felt like preparation. Naomi spread the pharmacy records across the kitchen table, beside the insurance papers, bank documents, ledger pages, and Grace's transcript. The story was all there now, no longer a series of strange moments or cruel coincidences, but a structure, a design. I stood over it for a long time. Then I picked up the page showing the first dosage increase, 6 months before Helena, 6 months before the locked windows, 6 months before Richard looked at the weather forecast and saw not danger, but opportunity. I looked at Naomi.
Call your attorney friend again, I said. She's already expecting us tomorrow. No, I said. Call her tonight. Naomi met my eyes, and this time she did not ask why. Because we both knew the truth now. The storm was not the first time Richard tried to take my life from me. It was just the first time he needed the weather to help him finish. The courtroom did not feel like justice at first. It felt like a room full of people trying to decide which version of my life sounded more reasonable. On one side of the aisle, Richard sat in a gray suit that looked newer than anything he had worn during the years we struggled to build a life together. His hair carefully combed, his posture composed in a way that would have convinced strangers he was a man who had simply made a mistake, not a man who had planned one. Evan sat behind him, not beside him, which told me more than anything else could have. Not close enough to be seen as a united front, not far enough to claim distance. His eyes moved constantly, never resting, as if the truth might walk in through the door if he stared long enough. On the other side, Naomi sat beside me, a legal pad in her lap, her pen uncapped but still, her fingers pressed tightly around it as if she needed something solid to hold on to while everything else shifted. There were 2 cases technically. A civil case for the financial damage, the forged signatures, the attempted loan against a house that was never his to leverage, and the fraudulent insurance adjustments that had been made quietly and deliberately in the weeks before the storm. And then there was the criminal case, the one that no one in the room could pretend was just paperwork, fraud, forgery, financial exploitation of an elderly spouse, and reckless endangerment. The phrase sounded clinical. It wasn't. It meant leaving someone in a locked house while a hurricane tore through the city. It meant calculating that fear and water and darkness might finish what paperwork alone could not. Richard's attorney spoke first. He was careful with his words, respectful in tone, strategic in what he chose to emphasize and what he left untouched. My client, he said, was under immense financial and emotional pressure. He made decisions out of fear. Poor decisions, yes, but not malicious ones. Fear. The word landed softly, too softly, as if fear explained everything, as if fear excused locking a window from the outside, as if fear justified taking medication decisions into your own hands, as if fear could rewrite a voicemail where a man calmly suggested that a storm might solve a problem faster than a lawyer. Naomi's pen moved once, then stopped. I did not look at her. I kept my eyes on Richard. He did not look at me at first. When he finally did, it was brief, controlled, almost practiced. Not guilt, not even shame. Calculation. The judge asked him to speak. He stood slowly, one hand resting on the table,
the other adjusting his jacket in a gesture I had seen 1,000 times before meetings, before dinners, before moments when he wanted to appear steady, even when he wasn't. "I never intended harm," he said. His voice was lower than usual, measured. "I was overwhelmed. I thought Margaret was slipping. I thought she needed structure, supervision. I made decisions to protect what we built. I was afraid of losing everything. Everything. The house, the accounts, the control." He paused. Then he did something I had not expected. He looked directly at me. "I'm sorry," he said. The room held its breath. Not because the apology mattered, but because everyone wanted to see what I would do with it. 40 years of marriage sat between us in that silence.
40 years of small habits, shared routines, ordinary mornings, quiet dinners, arguments that dissolved into apologies that meant something because they came before trust had been broken in ways that could not be repaired. And then there was that night. The locked windows, the missing medication, the sound of the wind pushing against the walls while I sat in the dark and understood, slowly and completely, that I had not been forgotten. I had been left. I stood, not because I felt strong, because I knew if I stayed sitting, the weight of everything might keep me there. "I believe you were afraid," I said. My voice did not shake. That surprised me more than anything else. "I believe you were afraid of losing control, of losing money, of losing the version of your life that depended on me not asking questions." The courtroom was silent. "You say you never intended harm," I continued. "But harm doesn't begin with intention. It begins with choices." I took a step forward. "Every time you told someone I was confused, that was a choice. Every time you picked up medication on my behalf and adjusted it without me knowing, that was a choice. Every time you put a paper in front of me when I was too tired to read it and told me it didn't matter, that was a choice." Richard's expression tightened. "And the night of the storm," I said, "when you closed those windows from the outside and told yourself it was for my own good." I paused, because that moment deserved to be said slowly. That was not fear. I looked directly at him. "That was the moment you stopped seeing me as your wife and started seeing me as an obstacle." The word hung in the air. Obstacle. Not partner, not family. Not someone who had built a life beside him. Something to be moved, removed, resolved. "You didn't lose me in this courtroom," I said quietly. "You lost me the moment you decided I was easier to manage than to respect." His eyes dropped then, not dramatically, just enough. The judge spoke after that, outlining findings that sounded clinical, again, but carried weight this time because the truth had already been spoken in plain language. The forged signature was confirmed. The insurance policy adjustments were deemed intentional and deceptive. The attempted loan against the house without my informed consent was ruled fraudulent. The medication interference, supported by pharmacy records and physician testimony, established a pattern of manipulation, and the night of the storm, the judge did not dramatize it. He didn't need to. "Reckless endangerment," he said, "is not diminished by familiarity. The defendant's relationship to the victim does not lessen the severity of the act." Richard was not taken away in handcuffs that day. This was not that kind of ending. There would be further proceedings, fines, restrictions, potential sentencing that would come later, after more filings, more arguments, more time. Justice, I learned, does not arrive in a single moment. It arrives in pieces. But the ruling was enough. The house remained mine. Every attempt to leverage it, transfer it, or claim control over it was voided. All powers of attorney were revoked. Every document bearing my name that I had not knowingly signed was invalidated. Evan was called to testify separately. His involvement in the bank process, the envelope on camera, the language he used when he thought no one was paying attention. He did not look surprised when the consequences reached him. That told me everything. Outside the courthouse, the air felt different, not lighter, just clearer. Naomi walked beside me in silence for a while before she finally spoke. "What happens now?" she asked.
It was the same question she had asked weeks ago, sitting on my couch with red eyes and a voice that sounded smaller than I had ever heard it. This time, I answered without hesitation. "Now we live," I said. "Not rebuild, not fix, live." I sold the company Richard had once run, not out of anger,
Out of clarity. It had never been mine in the way the house was, in the way my life needed to be now. The proceeds went into a trust Naomi helped structure, one that protected the assets from being touched without transparency, without consent, without the quiet manipulations that had defined the past year. I did not forgive Richard in the way people like to describe forgiveness. There was no conversation where everything softened, no moment where anger dissolved into understanding. I simply stopped carrying him. There is a difference. Forgiveness, I learned, is not always about the other person. Sometimes it is about refusing to let their choices continue to occupy space in your life. Weeks later, the rain came again. Not a storm, just a steady, quiet rain that tapped against the new windows I had installed. Windows that locked from the inside. Windows I checked myself before I went to bed. Not out of fear, but out of habit. I sat in the living room with the lights on, a book open in my lap, the sound of the rain filling the space in a way that no longer felt threatening. The phone sat on the table beside me, silent. No missed calls, no messages that demanded anything from me. For the first time in years, silence did not feel like something I had to survive. It felt like something I was allowed to have. I leaned back, listening to the rain, and realized something I had not understood that night in the storm. Survival is not the end of the story. It is the beginning of seeing clearly. And once you see clearly, you do not go back. Not to the lies. Not to the quiet erosion of yourself. Not to the version of love that asks you to disappear so someone else can feel secure. I did not survive that storm to stay silent. I survived it to finally hear myself. If this story meant something to you, leave a comment and tell me what stayed with you the most. You can subscribe if you'd like to hear more stories like this. And there's another one waiting for you right here. And if you've ever had to walk away from someone you thought would never turn on you, this channel is for you. I keep thinking about that night, the locked windows, the sound of the wind pressing against the walls, and a woman sitting in the dark realizing she wasn't forgotten. She was left. And I think about the moment she stopped asking why and started paying attention to what had been quietly happening for years. Sometimes survival isn't just about making it through the storm. It's about what you finally see when the noise is gone.